President Cyril Ramaphosa has written to Parliament objecting to the Impeachment Committee's recommendations of Advocate Thandazani Madonsela as its chief evidence leader. The committee selected Madonsela as evidence leader on the 5th of August. However, the President has raised two possible conflicts of interest regarding the advocate. The Impeachment Committee has met virtually to discuss this particular issue.
Yeah, in fact, Bongiwe, let's pick up on that story and sort of outline for you some of the issues that are at play. It was a big talking point in Parliament as the committee met to consider its draft report, and also how, not its draft report, but rather how to proceed in the wake of that court judgment that gave President Ramaphosa an interim interdict pending the review of the Section 89 independent panel. So as you rightly point out, Bongiwe, this is President Cyril Ramaphosa filing his submissions to the committee chaired by Makashule and objecting to the appointment of Advocate Madonsela, that is Thandazani Madonsela, also known as Griffiths Madonsela, SC. And the objection is basically on those grounds that you have to rewind back to around March 2022, when President Cyril Ramaphosa makes the decision to remove Advocate Madonsela as one of his representatives on the Judicial Service Commission. And in that commission, then Advocate Madonsela is then replaced by President Ramaphosa, replaced by Advocate Thandazani. And in the submissions that President Ramaphosa makes, he basically says that there's a reasonable apprehension of bias, or perhaps that there may be a sense of grievance on the part of Advocate Madonsela, and that Advocate Madonsela may act on that sense of grievance, and says this is something of a quasi-judicial or adjudicative process. So he won't just be neutral, but in the submission of the president, it's quasi adjudicative, so almost like a decision maker in a way. So you're not merely passive as evidence leader. But as I say, it wasn't received very well, certainly among the opposition benches. The key issue there is that issue of a possible conflict of interest. Of course, he was recommended and is to be appointed, and the decision was made that he would be appointed as evidence leader. This was at the meeting of the committee on the 5th of August. But that now stands in doubt with the debate that has now happened over the last while, following the submissions by President Ramaphosa. As I say, President Cyril Ramaphosa, the key issue that he raises is that possible personal grievance that I allude to, that dates back to his removal, Advocate Madonsela's removal from the Judicial Service Commission in around March 2022 or thereabouts, and replacement by Advocate Thandazani. And then, of course, the standard, the key issue there, if you are going to be in a sort of a decision-making position, quasi-judicial, quasi-adjudicative, or out-and-out presiding officer, it always comes down to the perception of bias. Is the perception reasonable? We can perceive bias, but is it reasonable that you perceive it that way? So I suppose that's the test, and Parliament has, after much debate, decided that what they're going to do is basically take this issue for independent legal advice. Of course, there was a lot of pushback among the opposition benches, your EFFs, your MK parties, and the ATM, among others, saying that President Cyril Ramaphosa is basically looking for any reason to stall and frustrate this process, this impeachment committee process, which the president's office has responded to and rejected. Now, as if that doesn't complicate things enough, the ANC, through its Secretary General, Fikile Mbalula, coming out and basically just giving a bit more detail and saying that actually, if you consider what President Ramaphosa says about the possible grievance following Advocate Madonsela's removal from the JSC, here's another factor for you to consider. He recently provided a legal opinion for the party as far as the impeachment processes are concerned. So basically, the ANC is saying that the matter in which he could play a role as evidence leader relates directly to processes and issues that have served before him in another capacity, where they instructed a firm of attorneys and said, see if you can get counsel to give us advice and give us legal opinion on what are, especially around the rules around impeachment. And that counsel, there was then, given that mandate by the firm of attorneys turned out to be Advocate Thandazani Madonsela, SC. So that's the other element of the conflict of interest that the ANC sees as far as that is concerned. So as I come back to this then, the way forward, Makashule Ghana, after much debate among the political parties, saying that perhaps we should take a step back. Let's not be emotional. Let's put politics aside and consider the legalities of this particular matter and maybe see if we can approach independent legal experts to give us a legal opinion. My understanding, Bongiwe, is that Advocate Madonsela himself, at the very first point at which talk of his nomination was made known to him, he did disclose that actually I've advised the ANC as far as this matter is concerned. Of course, that's a separate matter to that other matter that President Ramaphosa is raising about that possible sense of grievance following his removal from the JSC in 2022. So that's where things stand as far as that story is concerned.